Mark, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. And do you want to kick off with telling us a few things we can do with regards to our mobile phones?
Reducing the use of cell phones and maybe not having them constantly on would be the first step. I don't see any need why they should be constantly on. Everyone has voicemail, everyone has short message service and stuff like that. So if you really miss a call, then you can get it later. I mean, it was not a problem in the olden days when we had answering machines. Everyone loved them because they were the latest toys back then at that time. And today it must be constantly on, and I don't see why. So just reducing it a little bit would be a good idea, maybe. And by turning them off for a few hours, or when you're not having cellular service anyway, riding the underground, for example, or something like that, would be the first step, and not leaving them turned on like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there's airplane mode that we can make use of. I have a mobile phone which I use, but it does spend almost its entire day in airplane mode, and I tend to use it for the various other functions, such as video camera.
Absolutely. One switch, you just throw one switch in airplane mode, and you are mostly on the safe side. You are not always on the safe side. You have to make sure that Wi-Fi is probably also going off, because it is sometimes disconnected from the airplane mode, which means basically the wireless cellular communications. And sometimes you have also to make sure that the Wi-Fi function is also off. But yeah. Okay, just throw these switches and you're fine.
Absolutely. So it is possible just to turn airplane mode off selectively a couple of times a day. You can even go as far as holding a mobile phone in a selfie stick. Dr. McCullough demonstrated that if you held it at about a meter away from you, you've mitigated against the worst effects of it while in that actual operating mode.
Yes, it's all possible. I mean, it looked a bit cumbersome to me. I would rather put it on the table in front of me or something like that, and then I'm not even connected via this jack. That's even better, maybe. But anyway, there are solutions, and a selfie stick is something everybody has as well these days, so why not use them for this?
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing is using mobile phones in cars, of course. Be careful using a mobile phone inside a vehicle. It's a metal shell, and it acts to some extent as a Faraday cage where signals bounce around inside the inside the structure. So it's a good idea to avoid operating
Absolutely.
Phones in the car.
And the phones, they are so intelligently made these days, they just power up in order to still maintain the connection, and then you are exposed to even more because that's the way it has to be designed in order to function.
So it's going to crank. Does that mean it's going to crank its power up in the car in order to make sure that the bounced around signal can actually get out? I suppose that's how it's working, isn't it?
Yes, the phone basically powers up to its maximum transmission, which is 1 watt or maybe 2 watts in some cases. GSM is 2 watts, but the 1800 and 1900 networks, they have 1 watt as a maximum. Anyway, so this maximum is reached when you're in the car, because the phone tries to do what's technically the right thing, but it's not healthy for you.
So this is interesting. Also, with regards to airplane mode and connectivity, you can selectively turn on and off your Wi-Fi, your network connection, and your Bluetooth. Generally, I can on my phone, on the iPhone, and various others. It's similar. So sometimes, for example, if you know that you're on just using Bluetooth, turn the others off, or turn off whichever one you're not using. I mean, that's a small step towards reducing your exposure.
It is easy, and it's just one step, as you said. It's just one switch, and you just have to know them. You have to know where they are. They are usually very easy to find in settings. So it's just something you have to get used to, and then you can do it. And
if you want help. If you don't want accelerated aging on steroids, then this is what you have to do. Just in case we didn't mention it, of course, using the phone on speaker is almost all the time is absolutely the way to go, unless you really do need privacy. So speakerphone, very handy. You can just put the phone down there and not even touch it, and have a very good conversation with someone. The microphones are very, very good. It's not really a limitation.
Yes, that's true. And speaker means the real speaker, and not earphones, because earphones have other problems again. They connect to the phone and make all these wireless signals, and the microwave radiation travel into your ear and directly into your head. which you don't want either.
What about those air tube versions, Mark? Do you know about those? Because there's
Yes,
they're better, aren't they? Fundamentally better because I think they're just using a tube of air. Is that right?
absolutely. Yes, that's a very simple workaround. They just have the earpieces and they put a little piece of plastic tube over it, and then they just put the tube end into the ear, and the wired connection and the earpieces, they end like 20 centimeters or maybe a foot from your head, and that is pretty good already because the radiation stops there, and then you only have the air tubes transmitting the audio you want.
Fantastic. So that's essentially a snapshot of mobile phones, your fertility, and the capacity for you to even have children and grandchildren. So it's a really big deal. What else do we need to know about Wi-Fi, Mark?
Just as you said, hardwiring everything, and it's not just the health aspects, it's also better privacy, it is also data protection, it is data security, it is your whole network integrity. Every professional network installation is always a wired one, at least where it matters. So if there's business critical content, then it has to be protected. It has to be protected by wired networks, no matter how safe everyone says the encryptions of the wireless ones are. They are not. They are the easiest ones to break. I mean, there are better ones around these days, but still, from the data protection standpoint, it's also interesting and it's also useful to use hardwired connections. But to come back to our topic of the EMF radiation, it is just the better way. It is also the faster way, by the way, if you want some other benefits on top of just not being exposed to the unhealthy effects. You also get faster connections, faster downloads, maybe a movie with less freezing and whatever you have. So I wouldn't know why I should use wireless unless I have to, and maybe there's no wired connection around. You just need to get familiar with everything that's in it, and that's usually these days this so-called smart technology, and then you have to know how to turn it off. It's easy as that, but you probably have to refer to the manual and to just read this F-word manual, as the saying goes, and then you are fine and you know what you can do.
Totally. So the last thing I suppose with Wi-Fi is to also remember that games consoles, Xboxes, and all these sorts of things, make sure they're switched off or their Wi-Fi is disabled, or even pull the plug out the wall if you need to when they're not in use. Better still, go and find something else to do outside, maybe.
Better, yes.
So let's move into another category then, where people need to be aware, and that is the use of Bluetooth technology. There are so many devices coming in now, and one that springs to mind to me, Mark, is the sort of modern ghetto blaster, where you just turn up a party with this fantastic speaker, modern technology, excellent sound systems. It's Bluetooth, and you just hook your mobile phone up to it. Bingo! I mean, what a great idea in theory. Unfortunately, the Bluetooth is the bad part of the idea, and the fact that it's unwired, although it's immensely convenient, is the damage done to our health.
Yes, it is convenient, and during a party it might not even be so bad, because I mean, how long does a party last? It's maybe okay if you're really young, then it's maybe 8 hours, but usually it's more like 2 or 3 hours, and then you're exposed to Bluetooth during that time. Still not good, but if it's only that source of Bluetooth, then you would be pretty good off. But on the other hand, it's the constant exposure again, and the Bluetooth devices, they are everywhere. And if you got speakers in your home stereo system, for example, then you're exposed all the time.
So Bluetooth headphones are a no-no. I've seen some people working and enjoying their day, whistling away with a Bluetooth headphone, perhaps for noisy equipment and stuff. Not a good idea, guys. You're much better off, with wired headphones, with playing from your mobile phone in your pocket. It's just much safer.
Manufacturers, they are increasingly pushing in this direction. I mean, there have been iPhones by Apple which don't even have the conventional plug anymore, and they want to replace everything by Bluetooth because they can control the digital restrictions management more easily, because you cannot tap into the signal and make pirate copies and stuff like that. So for the manufacturers, it seems to be a good idea to have it. On the other hand, they have turned back and they are now reintroducing the conventional plugs. So obviously there are people out there who tell them they want the other solution and they want to stay with the conventional one, which is the standard hardwired earphone, which, of course, for all the reasons we mentioned, I would do too.
I think it's really important that people remember that we have consumer power, and if we again want to claim to be more conscious than otherwise, we need to know about these things, and it's just irrational to act against something that we know to be harmful. So it's just worth people sort of bearing in mind, and with things like Bluetooth. Again, maybe using in the car, it is, it's obviously safer in terms of using a phone in the car on Bluetooth. But again, that Faraday cage effect making the harmful effects worse. So let's move on to our second category now of remediation devices, and let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you can buy to help mitigate your exposure, basically. And the first one that springs to me, although I haven't got it right here at the moment, is my Faraday bag for keeping my mobile phone in. So, they cost about $15 or so on Amazon. A useful thing, you know that your device is completely not emitting anything if it's in that Faraday bag, and these sorts of things, that even extends to sleeping bags. You can sleep in a Faraday bag to protect yourself at night. So these things are very, very useful to know.
There is a range of products available, and they're usually based all on the same methods and techniques, which is having some silver lining inside, or some particles that align and build up a little kind of mesh network or something like that, and then they are grounded somewhere to the mains outlet.
So you basically mean things like those Faraday sleeping nets. You can get those Faraday sleeping nets, can't you, that have silver thread. Basically the Faraday cage, or the electromagnetic field and pulse microwave radiation blocking effect, the Faraday effect, is achieved through this mesh of
Yes, they're among them, but it goes even further. There's even building materials and building biologists. They have a whole range of tools available to remediate all sorts of exposure you can have after all these, after we mentioned all these sources of wireless communications and radiation and radar and whatever. So you also have real building materials like mats. You have special paints with silver particles in it, and then you have only some corners you have to ground after everything is applied. I've also seen for the first time someone remediating their roof. This is something I have thought about myself already, and I thought of chicken wire, or of several layers of chicken wire put together in order to reduce the size of the net. And actually there are even smaller ones available. They look like traction mats for a car or something like that, or even smaller with 1 millimeter or 0.5 millimeter networks net in it, and they are just covered under the roof tiles or something, and they can be applied retrospectively to a building. Even you can do it afterwards. So if you just want to redo your roof, then you can apply these mats, and again you have to ground them properly after they are applied, and then you get a very nice shielding that takes away up to 90, 95, maybe even 99% of the common frequencies that are flying around outside these days.
Yeah, and also, of course, it's worth mentioning that you can get these. You can earth your computer, your laptop, by simply connecting in through the USB socket direct to an earth socket. That's a device that I got recently, which I noticed collapsed the electrical field around my MacBook Pro here. It collapsed it from about 1.5 meters out down to a matter of inches. So it's very important to earthing is very important in dealing with these electrical fields.
Yes, absolutely. These are the smaller steps you can take, but also the faster ones, because they are much easier and start at the very places, at the emitting places and the units you may use, and particularly like notebook computers, which you are touching most of the time, because that's the entire purpose of the computer. And when it's a notebook, then everything is integrated, and even the keyboard is then probably with a very high electrical field. If you have it separately, like this one, where you just have the keyboard separately, then there's a lot less of an electric field emitted, but there may still be some, because it's traveling over the wire, of course.
That is a wired keyboard, is it, Mark? It's not a Wi-Fi one, is it?
It's a wired one, yes, but
because that's another thing, isn't it, to be aware of, isn't it? With people have their desktop and their screen, and they might have a wireless device as a keyboard, remote keyboard. So another thing to be aware of.
Yes, absolutely. That's the second source then again, but then you would have Bluetooth all around again, and that falls into the third category we mentioned earlier.
So as well as all these sort of Faraday things like sleeping bags and nets, there's of course all the EMF resistant clothing, beanies, vests and underwear and all that sort of stuff that are coming on the market. And as these things are emerging, these products, obviously we can't claim to be comprehensive. It's people's ingenuity. More things are coming on the market all the time. But it's a really good idea to be aware of this, because these sorts of things can help protect us. And another thing that comes under remediation devices is things like isolating your sleeping area from electrical fields, because even if you just have a ring main that isn't in a conduit pipe around the wall, and your bed is parked next to it, or you're sleeping next to it, the unshielded electrical cable, unless it's isolated, will be humming with 50 hertz or 60 hertz, and that electrical field is detrimental while we sleep as well. So things like isolation switches, in order to isolate the electricity from at least away from your bed area, if not your entire bedroom, is a really good idea to sleep in an EMF free zone, not only with your mobile phone switched off and your Wi-Fi switched off and all of these things, kill all those electrical fields, and then maybe even use an electrical grounding sheet to ground your body to the earth electrically and make use of those free electrons when your body's in that rejuvenative phase at night. Really important to not be exposed to the extra reactive oxygen species and DNA damage going on in your cells from the electrical fields, but to actually avail yourself to the free electrons via your earthing sheet that you may elect to sleep on. So that's worth bearing in mind as well, these sorts of remediation devices.
It only makes sense, though, after you did all the other things of getting rid of the sources of the electromagnetic fields, because if you don't and only use a grounded sheet, for example, then you would even increase the flow of electricity through your body, because then everything of these distortions comes in, and your body is a little bit like an antenna, and then you just collect it all around, and then you get rid of it via the sheet, and you have an increased electrical flow. So do the remediation and the switching off and the avoidance and everything first, and then get also the sheet you mentioned, and then you have probably the best setup you can have.
That is a really good point. Thank you for making that. And just to hammer it home, I'm even going to repeat it. I think before you use a grounding sheet or any grounding device, it's really important to have eliminated all the electrical fields first. That is so important.
The risk or the danger is always that people might see the grounding sheet as a silver bullet and say, okay, that's very easy, I can do that, and then I can turn my mobile phone on. No, you can't. That's absolutely the point you have to remember, and that's good that you pointed it out again.
That reminds me, Mark, of another really important point. And we're talking here about remediation devices. We're talking about things that can help protect us or avoid exposure. And one thing I think is very important to be people to be aware of is things that are claiming to harmonize or use with crystals or something, devices with a load of pretty stones in it that's sort of plugged in somewhere. That really isn't going to cut it, ladies and gentlemen. These things, I believe, are a scam, to the extent that I've measured some of them and played around with them and found it very difficult to detect any effect. So I'm very, very skeptical about those kinds of devices.
I believe they might be useful if there are very, very low levels, residual levels of EMFs coming in, and maybe they can harmonize that.
When you can measure a field one side of a Faraday fabric and not the other side, you can see that it's actually happening in reality.